You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
We're hearing a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. Tell us more about that organization and who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood.
The Muslim Brotherhood is a very old organization. I mentioned Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. One of his acolytes, one of his followers was a man named Hassan al-Banna. And Hassan al-Banna was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1910s, 1920s. And the Muslim Brotherhood carries out three precepts that were established by Jamal al-Din. And the first precept is to purify religion, that is, become good Muslims. Jamal said, one of the reasons you've become weak and prey to European powers is that you've been backsliders, you haven't been good Muslims. And so one of the important things to do is to become observant again. The second is that reform is needed, and that is that Islamic law and Islamic principles had not been revised, or there had been no opinions made on modern affairs. So although usury, for instance, is prohibited in Islam, no one has said anything since the 9th century about a bank. Or what about television, and what about movies, and all of these things that could potentially have something to do with Islamic principles. So reform was the second point. The third point was resistance, and that is to resist the influence of the Western world and Westernization, to avoid corruption and avoid exploitation. So the Muslim Brotherhood actually embodies all these three principles: purity of religious belief, reform of religion, and also resistance to external forces from the outside world. And I want to emphasize the second point, reform, because we have some very prominent thinkers in the United States who claim that there was never a reform movement in Islam, including people like Tom Friedman. And Tom Friedman, who I admire in many ways, is simply ignorant on this point. That in fact there was a very strong reform movement, and it continues down to the present day.
There's obviously a great deal of uncertainty now in Egypt, but let's go back in history to the point when President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981. Obviously a time of instability in Egypt, but the transition didn't really result in a great deal of chaos in the country. Do you see this transition happening in a similar way, or are there too many variables, too many unknowns to see how smooth this transition will be to a more democratic Egypt?
Well, President Sadat was assassinated by people who came out of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and he was actually quite unpopular in Egypt, and many people thought that he was a person who had sold out the Egyptian nation for the Camp David Accords. And they also saw him growing away from Egyptian culture. He showed up in Pierre Cardin suits and was traveling to Europe regularly, and many people thought that he'd lost the common touch. So after he was assassinated, actually the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood were hunted down by Mubarak and executed. So that was a very stringent and very strong reaction to his assassination. There were a number of people who were killed, who were executed, who probably had nothing to do with his assassination. But it was a warning shot to the religious fundamentalists in Egypt that they were not to interfere in the government in the future. So it may have appeared to be a peaceful transition on the surface, but actually the government immediately imposed a state of emergency in Egypt, which has been in effect for the last 30 years. And that means no assembly, nobody can protest against the government. They've kept the lid on things in a very, very severe and repressive crackdown.
To what extent has the United States handled this situation well, and where maybe have we failed in terms of dealing with the unrest in Egypt and other countries?
Well, the United States can be accused of a great deal of hypocrisy in its dealings with other nations. We favor democratic institutions for countries that we disagree with. If the country is a country that is doing what we want them to do, like for instance Bahrain, right now because there was unrest in Bahrain today. The United States doesn't call for the leader to be removed. It calls for the leader to address the needs of the people. So we had an interesting contrast today between Iran and Bahrain. So the United States calls on the people in Iran to resist their rulers. They call on the rulers of Bahrain to address the needs of the people. It's really the same kind of protest, but we're reacting to it in completely different ways depending on our self-interest. And I think that it would be lovely if the United States could be consistent about supporting democratic institutions everywhere, not just in the places where we have disagreements with the government, but also in places where we have some influence and where we realize that the government is not treating its citizens very well.
Professor Bill Beeman, Chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
You're most welcome.
When Access returns, we'll explore the Egypt of 3,000 years ago.